I had the wide-eyed, idealized version of what college living would be like. I'm a bit of an introvert, but I was hoping that shipping from home would be a way for me to turn that around. No one would know me where I was going. No one would remember that time I pissed my pants in gym. No one would remember that time I asked out the pretty girl from high school, and no one would remember my mental breakdown after getting rejected that forced me to take off school for a few years and focus on myself. In fact, as far as anyone listening to this is concerned, none of that happened. Forget it. I was a blank slate. The case of the strange penny-sized hole in my small one-room apartment was nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't so much concerned with its existence as I was with the fact that I would not be in a dorm room forced to share the place with some jock mouth breather. Plenty of the apartments came with flaws, and this was nothing out of the ordinary. The real problem arose when I noticed that there was an identical, penny-sized hole in the exact same spot on the wall across from it. When I initially examined it, I concluded that perhaps my apartment room had once housed plumbing, but when I hunkered down to look into them, I could see that they did seem to go entirely through the wall, but I could only make out the faintest light on the other side. This was nothing out of the ordinary, as the complex I lived in had once been an industrial factory. Still strange. As I looked from the doorway at the hole on the left wall and the hole on the right wall, I felt a strange buzzing sensation in my ears. It was like the sounds of an electric razor lodged in my brain. I ignored this, of course, and placed my bed so that it only touched the one wall directly across from my doorway, a few feet from either hole. Still, though, the holes in my room were a constant sight of embarrassment, if only to me, so I decided to cover them with post-it notes. I wouldn't have to live there long, and I could always cover them later more permanently. Things went on. I took my medication, I went to classes, I learned how to communicate with the people in my apartment building with varying degrees of success. For me, drinking had never really been an option when thinking of college. Of course not. You know, I wanted something else, something very different. I wanted to lose my virginity. And the girl in the room directly next to mine was as socially inept as I was when it came to speaking with people. I could just tell. The way she averted her eyes, the way that she hid behind her hair, the way she smiled meekly at every little thing that others said, I knew this girl was my primary target. I locked my sights on her, and would sometimes, every so often, press my ear to the wall we shared and listen to her breathing. I swear she must have slept with her bed pushed directly against the wall and her back right on the drywall, because I could honestly hear her breathing when she slept. What can I say? I'm a romantic. Then came the long audible sounds of pleasure coming from the other side of the wall. It had to have been her. I found myself fantasizing over what sort of whirring mechanism she used on herself to produce such wonderful vocal performances. Though, now that I think about it, her voice never came out as crisp and clean as it did when I would pass her in the halls, and I never did hear her say any words. It was only that low, animalistic growling or lip-smacking. Still, call it a psychic connection. I knew she wanted me to come through the wall. When I would pass her by, I could see the bags under her eyes had grown swollen and purple. Her face was flushed and her hair unkempt. Of course, I knew why, even if no one else did. She hardly got any sleep at all. Then came our serendipitous meeting in the elevator, where I accidentally struck the emergency stop button with my elbow. She didn't notice, but watching her face go panicked let me know that I had her in a vulnerable position. So I asked her out, and she said yes. I'll tell you, once the maintenance woman let us out, I had an entirely new spring in my step. I had a date. We met at a local pub, and I sipped on my beer while urging her to drink as well. I'm not much of a drinker, but the nerves were getting to me, and I totally intended to find myself in her room later that night. I wanted nothing more than to see the sort of secrets such a mild-mannered young woman could hide. Have you noticed the noises at night? They've been keeping me up. It's so hard to sleep, she said, as she thumbed her fingers across the booth table we sat at while watching me with glossed eyes and rose cheeks. I figured I couldn't have looked any more sober than her. I assumed this was her coy way of bringing up the noises I'd heard all those many nights since moving into the place. Was this her attempt to tell me that she knew I'd been listening to her? I played it cool. Oh yeah, I've been having trouble sleeping too. The noises are a bit much in that old building, aren't they? Her eyes sparkled. So, I'm not crazy. I thought that maybe I'd been hearing the noises in my own head, but it sounds like they're coming through the walls. What do you think they could be? My lips offered a wry smile. You haven't the faintest idea, huh? I covered my smile with a sip of beer. Her piano-player fingers clung to her strands of hair anxiously, tugging out a clump. As she noticed she was holding on to hair no longer connected to her head, she tossed it to her feet and kicked it out of sight. Her beer was gone in seconds after, and she quickly ushered over the waiter for another. I don't know. There was a lowness in her spirits that I noticed for the first time. Something clicked in my head. She wasn't playing hard to get. I could tell that she had no idea where the noises were coming from. My stomach slipped and pushed on my bowels. I ignored my initial plans of getting into this girl's room for the sexy time. Do you have a hole on your side of the wall? I asked. There's a few nail or screw holes. Why? I could feel my expression squish into a more wrinkled and concerned one. How big are they? I don't know. I blurted out the next words. Can I come to your room tonight? The waiter arrived with her fresh beer, and he noticed the agitated way in which I'd asked the question. I could tell he was cutting his eyes at me, but I didn't care anymore. Something far more interesting than the prospect of sex had come up. She eyed me for a moment before shrugging. Whatever. We arrived at the apartment complex, and it felt like a new place entirely. It was no longer cheap student housing, but a place with dark secrets. The night air was cold, and as we entered the building, the chill tickled up my arms. As we came to the hallway with our rooms, we shared a glance. She pushed her key in, and we fell into the room. Her bed was against the wall opposite the one we shared. Holy shit, I whispered. What? She asked, visibly confused. Nothing. I played it cool. Against the wall we shared, I could see she'd pushed a metal-framed futon against it. She closed the door behind us. Do you ever sleep on that? I asked while motioning to the futon. She shook her head, her hands instinctively grasping onto her hair once more. Nope. Without asking, I threw myself violently at the futon, scooting it from the wall to expose nothing. So what, right? So what? There's a couple of impossible holes in my room. That doesn't mean it's the end of the world. I did something that I'd not done in my whole life. I grabbed her clammy little hand. She let out an audible gasp at my touch, but I rushed her from the room and took us to mine, shoving the door in. There they were. The post-it notes I'd covered them with now rested upon the floor. They were gaping at me, nearly breathing, I locked the door behind us, feeling the cool sweat roll down my forehead. As I whipped from the door, I saw that she'd already approached the hole on the wall we shared. "Holy shit," she hushed while reaching out and touching the outer edges of the pulsating hole's raised flesh. "They've never done that before." I approached behind her and peered over her shoulder. "Can you hear that?" she asked while looking over her shoulder at me. "Hear what?" I asked. "They're speaking," she continued, tracing her finger around the hole. "Do they normally speak?" My mind shot to the times I was certain that she was somehow physically linked to me. No, of course not. They're just stupid holes. She pushed her index finger in and immediately gasped. "Oh!" I jumped, certain that something terrible was happening. "What?" "That feels amazing." I raised an eyebrow and looked at the hole. It had conformed its way halfway up her index finger, suckling. I could hear it suckling. "This is so cool," she said. Then the room was filled with a ridiculous suction, that mechanical whir and the sounds of bone snapping. It was a blinding noise, and I clasped my hands over my ears. I could feel a nosebleed coming on, and before I knew it, the whole front of my shirt was covered in my own blood. I squinted through tears at her. She was screaming. The wall had taken her to her knees, and its mouth now enveloped her arm to the elbow. There was blood and shredded viscera coming from around the hole like a person spitting watermelon seeds. I reached out for her without thinking. I only meant to help, but my fingers tangled around her hair and tore it away in clumps. As I stared down at the mess of tangled hair in my fingers, I screamed. She'd been taken at her waist, and her screams were long gone, but the sounds of the impossible hole continued its consumption of the limp legs, knees, ankles, toes. She was gone, and the hole slowly shrank to its average penny size. Shaking, I took myself from the room, hearing nothing as I went. I was imprisoned in a daze as I went down the hall to the communal bathroom. While I washed myself in the sink with the door locked, I'd nearly convinced myself that I'd made it all up. It was another strange manifestation of mine, that's all. After tossing my bloody shirt in the trash, I returned to my room. Upon seeing the oozing blood dribble from the wall hole that had consumed her, I knew I'd not made it up. I stood there with my back pressed against the door. The next thing I heard was a strange gurgling. My eyes locked on the carnivorous wall hole, but it was not coming from there. I slowly turned my head to focus on the hole on the opposite wall. It puckered like a sphincter, and it came from that hole in a stream akin to hot diarrhea. Who could I tell? I'd be thrown in prison for sure. I'm prime suspect numero uno. I told precisely no one, and the walls call to me. My brain is on fire, and I can feel that whirring all the time.